Hey there, folks, and welcome back to the final video in this Basics of Web Development tutorial series. We've covered all of the basics of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, so now it's finally time to put it all together and create a simple number guessing game. You may have seen a preview of the final result in the first or previous episodes, but I've also created this mockup of what we're going to build. I used a free online tool called Excalidraw to make this mockup. Link is in the description. Making something like this ahead of time can really help give you a good idea of what you'll need to put on the page using HTML and how you want to use CSS to lay it out. So we have a big box around all of the individual game elements, and inside that box is a vertical layout of a few different things. We have the header here with the name of the game. Below that is a short description telling you the number is between 1 and 100. Then we have the guess input and a couple of buttons, one to check the guess and another to reset the game. Below that is an area for a feedback message that will tell the player if the guess is too high or too low, or if they made an invalid guess like 0 or 101. And then at the bottom, we have a couple statistics, their current number of attempts and their high score, or low score, I guess. Now, I mentioned this is a vertical layout, but some rows have more than one element, so they'll need to be wrapped in a container div so that the container can be a part of the main vertical layout, and then everything inside of those containers can have a horizontal layout. That being said, now that we have our mockups, we can start writing some code. I've already created a new project in VS Code and added some blank files, index.html, script.js, and style.css. I use the name index for the HTML file because by default, when a web server loads a web page in a browser, it's going to be looking for a file specifically called index.html first. Since we're running this project locally, it's not necessarily required. We could name the file something else and open it directly, but using index.html is a really common naming convention and good practice when building web projects. So without further ado, let's start in the HTML file, and we can use the exclamation point shortcut to generate some boilerplate. And then the first thing we'll do is change the title to guess the number. And then we can link our CSS and JavaScript files. So we'll use a link tag, set relationship to style sheet, and the href will be styles.css. And then for the script tag, we'll set the source to script.js. And then let's not forget to add defer here. All right, so to start in the body, we'll just add a new div to house the entire game, and we'll give it the class of container. And this is going to be that main box that's going to hold all of the other game elements. So let's just work our way down from the top, starting with the header. So we'll use an H1, guess the number. And under that, we'll add a paragraph element, and we'll give it the class of hint. And in here, we'll put, I'm thinking of a number between 1 and 100. Can you guess it? And then let's wrap the numbers in strong elements. Just do it like this. That way they show up bold. And let's just take a look at what we have so far. All right, pretty boring, but so far so good. All right, so in the next section, we have the guess input and the two buttons. So we'll first need to put them in a wrapper div. We'll give it the class of controls. Just add some room. And inside here, let's add our input element. We'll give this a few different attributes. We'll set the ID to guess input. Give it the type of number. And since we're using the type number, we can also set the min and max attributes for this input. And then finally, give it the placeholder of your guess. And then we'll add 2 buttons. The first will be used for checking the guess, and we'll give this an ID of check BTN. And we'll put just the word check in there. Then another one, which will give the ID of reset BTN. And this one will say reset. I want the reset button to be a different and more neutral color than the check button. So I'm going to also give it the class of secondary. That way in our CSS, we can target both buttons using the button element selector and then target this one specifically using the secondary class. All right, sweet. Looking good so far, though still very small and plain. With this input element, since we use the number type, we also get these little up and down arrows that let us kind of step through the different values that lie between the min and max attributes. I'm not going to click all the way to 100, but if I did, I can't click up anymore. It's maxed out at 100. Okay, and now we need our feedback message. So we'll add a new div. We'll give it the ID of message, and I'm also going to give it the class of message. The ID I'll use for the JavaScript and the class I'll use for the CSS. For now, we're just going to leave this empty. The message will change depending on what happens while the player is guessing, so we'll let our JavaScript control what gets displayed here. And then finally, we can add our stats. So we'll add another wrapper div and give it the class of stats. Oops, that's supposed to be an equals. And the first thing to go in here is going to be the current attempts. Attempts, colon and a space, and then the number will need to be targeted by JavaScript so we can wrap it in a span element and give that an ID. And we'll just start this out at 0. And then last, we'll need the best score area. So same thing here, best colon space, and then we'll use a span and give the span an ID of best. And in here, we'll just add a dash, since a 0 wouldn't really make any sense here. All right. Excellent. And we're good to go. That's all the HTML that we're going to need. Just to note, I have been adding these IDs and classes to the elements as I go, but that's mostly because I've already built this project before, so I already know what needs to be targeted by CSS or JavaScript. When you're building a project from scratch, it's totally fine to just get all the elements on the page first and then come back later to add IDs and classes once you start writing the CSS in JavaScript and recognize what elements that they will need to be interacting with. So next we can switch over to style.css and start working on the layout. First, we'll add a rule to the body element to center the main container div on the page. So we'll set the display to flex, and then we'll use align items set to center, justify content also set to center. And then we'll give it the min height of 100 VH or view height. So setting the min height to 100 view height ensures that the body element takes up the entire height of the browser's window so that the container can actually be vertically centered, which it is not. So let's see what went wrong there. Relation is style sheet, href, style. Oh, I added an extra S. It's just style.css. All right. There we go. Now the entirety of the game is right in the middle of the page. So next, let's add a rule on the container class. And let's give this a max width of 480 pixels. I'm going to set some padding to 20 pixels. We'll set text align to center, so all of that text content will be centered. And then we'll give it a visible border for now so that we can actually see where it is. All right, so far so good. So next up, we can make a rule for the controls div that holds the input and buttons. And we'll set this to a display of flex with a justify content of center, which so far that shouldn't change anything, except it does kind of squish them together a little bit. So let's use the gap property and set this to 8 pixels. All right, and that gives us a little bit of space between each of the elements without needing to add any margins or anything like that. So making our way down, right now, there's nothing inside the message div that is below the buttons, which means it doesn't have any height yet, but we can give it a minimum height so that when a message does appear, it doesn't push everything below it downward and change the entire shape of the game. So do this on the class message. We'll set a min height to 28 pixels. Just something a little bit bigger than the font size, which right now is the default of 16. And we'll make it bold using font weight. Cool. Now there's a little bit of space between the controls and the stats so that when a message appears, it'll just take up some of that white space. And then lastly, speaking of those stats, let's use Flexbox again to align the stats section horizontally and set this to justify content space between. All right, sweet. That's pretty much exactly what we had planned out in terms of the layout. So now we can move on to some more aesthetic CSS and start adding some colors and other details. So when it comes to the colors, I want to create a theme, essentially a set of colors that we can reuse for multiple different elements. And we can do this by setting some CSS variables, much in the same way that we can set and use variables in JavaScript. So at the top of the file here, I'm going to add a rule targeting :root. And this selector targets the root element or the highest level element in the document, which in the case of HTML is going to be the HTML element. And inside this rule, I'll declare a handful of variables using a pair of dashes followed by the variable name. And then just the value for the variable after the colon, just like any regular property. Use OB5CFF. And that's this nice blue color here. Picking colors isn't really my thing, so I just had ChatGPT give me a color palette to use. And let me just add the rest of them here. So we've got our secondary color, which is this nice gray. We have the background color, which is a bit of an off-white. And then we have these success, warn, and danger, which are green, orange, and red. And those will be used for stylizing the message div. So now that we've assigned these variables to these specific colors, we can then reuse these variables throughout the project. If we ever want to change that color as a part of the overall theme, we only need to update it here in the root where it's declared. So with those set, let's start by targeting the H1 element. And we'll set the color property to the value of var, followed by a set of parentheses. And then inside the parentheses, we'll add the variable name along with those 2 dashes. And now our header is in the primary color. Though I also want to remove that default top margin since the container already has 20 pixels of padding. Set it to 0. All right, that's better. And then next, we can use BG to set the background color of the body. Awesome. And real quick, before we continue with the colors, I want to get rid of this god-awful serif font. So we'll set font family to the system UI default that VS Code gives us. And then while we're here, we can go ahead and set the box sizing to border box. Much better. Now, I'd set the background of the body to this off-white BG color, but I actually want the game container itself to remain pure white so that it stands out just a little bit more. So back in our container rule, we'll set the background to white. And then in the final product, I'm actually not going to be using a visible border here. And instead, I'm just going to give it a box shadow. So we'll remove this, replace it with box shadow. And I'm going to set this to 0, 6 pixels, 20 pixels, and then RGBA 0, 0, 0 for the RGB values. And then for the alpha value, I'll use 0.1. So it'll be a really nice soft black. And then let's round the corners using a border radius of 12 pixels. All right, that's looking pretty sweet. Much better than just a plain black bordered box. Now, the hint below the header is actually now wrapping onto a new line. So let's reduce the font size just a little bit. And I'll add this just below the H1 rule, since that's where it appears on the page itself. We'll set the font size to 0.9 rem. Keep it relative to the root element. Perfect. So next up, let's work on the number input and those two buttons. Now, I was trying to lay out the CSS in the same order as the HTML. So I'm going to move these two rules down below the container. And then for the input, I can put it below the controls. And we'll just use the input element selector since there's only just the one. So let's give it a width of 120 pixels. And then we'll set the padding to 8 pixels, 10 pixels. So that's 8 pixels on the top and bottom and 10 on the sides. We'll use the secondary color for the border. Give it a border radius as well. Set it to 8 pixels. And then we'll set the font size to 1 rem to keep it relative, since the default font size for inputs is usually a little bit smaller than that. All right, looking better. So next up for the buttons, not plural, we'll give them a padding of 8 pixels, 12 pixels. We'll remove the border, but also round out those corners in the same way with the border radius of 8 pixels. Then we'll set the background color to primary. We'll set color to white. That's going to target the text. We'll use the cursor property and set it to pointer. Spelled cursor wrong. And then finally, font weight of bold. Cool. I like the way that looks. And I know you can't see my mouse, but using the cursor property set to pointer, when I hover over one of the buttons, my cursor is changing from the traditional mouse clicker to the pointed finger symbol. Now, right now, both of the buttons are using the blue primary color, but I actually wanted the reset button to use the secondary color instead. So just below the button rule, I'll add another one on button dot secondary. So that's any button with the secondary class. And for this one, we'll set the background color to secondary and overwrite that primary color. Just like that. Next up, I want to add some colors to the message that will appear below those buttons, but that's kind of hard to test when there's nothing there. So let's go back to our HTML. We'll just add testing here for the time being. All right, so first off, that's sitting really close to the buttons. So let's just add a bit of a bottom margin to the controls div. And set it to 12 pixels. All right, that's better. So the idea here is that we will use JavaScript to set the text of this message, but we'll also add a second class to it in addition to just that message class. And this will let us apply different colors to the message depending on the situation. For example, if the guess is too high or too low, we can use that orange warn color. If the guess is invalid, we can use the red error color. And if the guess is correct, we'll use the green success color. So just below the main message rule, message.success, color is var success. And then the same thing for warn. Didn't mean to add a P there. And then for error, all right. And so to test this, we can just temporarily add another class separated by a space to the message element. And it shows up as green when we use success, set it to warn, and now it's orange. And then finally, error. And that didn't actually work. So let's see. We named it danger. You know what? Let's just change it to error instead of danger to make it more consistent with the class names. All right, now it's working. And as far as styling goes, that's pretty much it. However, if we open the DevTools and take a look at what the page looks like on a phone, let's set this to something a little bit smaller, like 400. It looks okay, but the horizontal layout of the controls can make things a little bit difficult to use with touch inputs. So let's add a media query that will trigger when the screen is 480 pixels or less in width. Media max width, 480 pixels. And in here, we'll add a rule for the controls div to override the horizontal layout and stack everything vertically instead. So we'll set the flex direction to column and then align items in the center. All right. Then let's just make the buttons and the guess input a little bit bigger so that they're easier to tap. Button and input. Set this to width. Let's give it 75% of the parent. Excellent. That's looking pretty good, and that should about do it. That wraps up all of the CSS that we're going to need. So let's just remove our testing message. And now that we have all of our elements on the page and they're looking how we want them to, we can wire up the game with some JavaScript. So in script.js, the first thing we'll need to do is generate a random number that the user will be guessing. And to do this, we'll use a built-in JavaScript object called math and call the random method, which gives us a random decimal number between 0 and 1, but not including 1. So we'll set this up in a function called randomInt. And we'll say const rand equals math.random. Doesn't need to take in any arguments. Let's just see what that gives us so far. Right, go to the console. And so now anytime that we refresh the page and this function runs, we see a long randomly generated decimal number logged in the console. So we can set this number to be between 1 and 100 by multiplying it by 100, which gives us a number between 0 and 99.999, etc. And then just adding 1 to shift that range up a little bit. So instead, we'll say const result equals rand times 100 and plus 1. And then we'll just console log result. We'll see what that gives us this time. Excellent. Now, this technically is giving us a number from 1 up to just under 101, but we can drop everything after the decimal point using math.floor. So instead of the console log, let's return math.floor and pass in the result variable. So math.floor doesn't round the number, it just removes everything after the decimal portion. So if result came out to be 100.8965, whatever, math.floor would just drop it to 100 as opposed to rounding it up to 101. So to see this, let's just move the console log down here to the function call. And I get 45, refresh the page, 100. Hey, how about that? 12, 63, 29. Perfect. Looks to be working. So to use this number throughout the project, we're going to need to save it to a variable. So we'll declare a new variable called secret number up here at the top. And we'll just declare it here for now, because next we can set up a function to initialize the game and assign it there. And then we'll also be able to reuse that initialize game function whenever the reset button is clicked. So const init game. And then we'll set secret number to the result of random int. And then we can add a console log line for debugging purposes. And then finally, we just need to call the function right away when the page loads. So now we can move on to the real heart of the program, and that is going to be the function that runs when we click the check button. So this function is going to need to do a bunch of things. First, it will need to read the guess from the input, then check if the guess is valid. If it's not, show an error. If it is valid, then update the attempts statistic and check if the guess is correct. If it is correct, we'll show a correct message, update the stats, and end the round. If it's not, we'll check whether the guess is too high or too low and update the message accordingly. Now, before we can do any of that, we're going to need to grab a bunch of different things from the DOM. So we'll start with the input, call it guess input, document.get element by ID, and ID is also guess input. The check button, I guess we might as well grab the reset button while we're here. We'll need the message div. Set this to message text. The attempts span. And then finally, the best score span. Hopefully I got all of those IDs correct. And then we'll just need a couple more variables up here at the top to track the stats. So let attempts, we'll set this to 0. And then let best score. And we'll set this to null since a best score of 0 wouldn't make any sense. And now we can set up the guess function. So first things first, we need to grab the value from the guess input. Save this to a variable called raw guess input.value. Nope, just value. Now, before going any further, let's hook up the handle guess function to an event listener on the check button so that we can test things out. So check button.add event listener. Set this to click. and then call handle guess. Let's add a console log for that raw value and test it out. So I have 100 in the input, click check, and it gives us 100. If I change this to 55, click check, and it says 55. So you might notice that the value for the raw variable is showing up in white, while the secret number line at the top shows the value in green. And that's because right now the raw variable is a string and not a number. So let's convert it to a number. Spelled const wrong, whoops. And then if we console log guess instead, excellent. Now it shows in green, which is the dev console's way of showing us that that is a number data type. Next step, we'll need to make sure that the number entered in the input is a valid guess. So let's get rid of the console log, and we'll start an if statement. And in here, we'll use the isInteger method from the number object to check if the guess is a whole number rather than a decimal number or something with letters. And then we will flip the value with a bang, since we want to check if it's not an integer. And then we can just use or guess is less than 1, or guess is greater than 100. And then inside this block, we can set the message text content to say, enter a whole number between 1 and 100. And then we'll set message text.class name, not class list, class name. We'll set this to message space error. And then if the guess is invalid, there's no reason to keep going. So we can just use return here to exit the function early. And let's test that out. So if we enter 0 here, it says enter a whole number between 1 and 100, shows up in red. And then let's try 101, same thing. And then let's enter some letters. Sweet, that's working. And then finally, let's enter a valid guess. And the check button does nothing. Sweet. So if the guess is valid, that means we never entered this if block, which means we never hit the return statement. So any code after this point will only run for valid guesses. And the next thing that we'll need to do is update the attempts variable. So we'll say plus equals 1. Attempts needs to be plural. And then we'll set attempts text.text content to equal the value of the variable attempts. Let's check that out. If I guess an attempt changes to 1, I can click it more times and attempts keeps going up. Perfect. So now that we have a valid guess and the attempt stat is updated, we now need to check if guess equals secret number. And if it is, we can set the message text.text content to be correct. The number was plus secret number. And then we'll set the class name to message space success. All right, so our secret number this time is 86. Awesome. The right message shows up and it shows in green. I need to capitalize the T. Now, something is looking a little familiar here. So for both an invalid guess and a correct guess, we're setting the message text content and then changing the class name to style it. Since that's the same behavior, just with different inputs, we can actually extract that into its own function. So down here, let's create a new function called showMessage. And this will take in 2 inputs, text and type, which will represent the type of message it is, success, warn, or error. And so in here, we'll do the same thing as before, message text.text content. We'll set that to the text argument. And then message text dot class name equals message with a space plus type. So now we can go back up here, show message, and then let's just copy paste this for text. And the type will be error. You can remove these two lines. And then same thing here, show message. We'll take this for text. And then success. Need to get rid of that semicolon. And then we can remove these two lines. And let's just make sure that things are still working. So if we use 0 for an invalid, great, still shows up in red. And right now 82 is our correct number. Awesome, it's the correct message and it shows in green. All right, so now if the guess is correct, then we'll need to do a few more things. We'll need to check if the best score should be updated, and then we'll disable the guess input and check buttons so you can't keep guessing after you've already won. And to save some space in the handle guess function, I'm just going to pull this into another separate function that we'll call end round. So we'll first just need to check if attempts is less than best score. However, on the very first round, when the page loads, best score is initialized to null, and comparing a number to null might give unexpected results. So we'll first check if best score equals null as well and link them with an OR operator. And then if either of those are true, we'll set best score to the value of attempts, and we'll set best text.text content to the value of best score. And then finally, we will set guess input.disabled to true, not true. Oh my gosh. And then the same thing for the check button. And then now, if the guess is correct, we just need to call the end round function. All right, our secret number is 33. Awesome. So we see that the best stat is updated to 1, and when I try to click on the check button or the guess input, nothing is happening because they are disabled. And if we test it again, 64, great. Now, right now, I'm currently using the browser's refresh button to reset the game, but that's obviously not ideal. So let's add a few things to the init game function and hook it up to the reset button. So if we think about everything that needs to be reset, we'll set attempts to 0. We'll set the attempts text also to 0, or the value of attempts. We'll call show message. And we'll put, let's say, make your first guess. And then we won't use anything for the type. Guess input we'll set to empty. And then let's make sure that guess input is no longer disabled. And same thing for the check button. And then finally, down here with the other event listener, say reset button.add event listener. Click and init game. All right. Oh, we're getting a little error here. Invalid assignment to const guess input. What is that? Let's see. Oh, this needs to be .value, not just guessed input. All right, so our secret number is 23. Actually, let's make a couple wrong guesses. And then, cool, so now best is set to 6. And if we click reset, best stays at 6. But if we guess this in one guess, excellent, best is updated to 1, the new low score. All right, so now back to the handle guess function. the last thing we need to add is checking whether an incorrect guess is too high or too low. So we can add an else if after checking if the guess is correct and check if it's too low. It's less than secret number. And if so, we will call show message. We'll say too low, try a higher number. And the type will be warn. So at this point, after the else if, we know the guess is valid, it's not correct, and it's not less than the secret number, which only leaves one option. It's higher. So rather than checking for that explicitly, we can just use else here. And then the same thing, we'll call show message to high, try a lower number. And then once again, set it to warn. All right. So our secret number is 69. Try something that's too low. Too low, try a higher number. Let's do 70. Too high, try a low number. Perfect. All right. So at this point, the game is essentially complete. But there is one last small feature I want to add. Let's allow the player to press the enter key to submit a guess. And we can do that down here with the other event listeners. And on guess input, we will call the key down event listener. Need to add my parentheses here. And then for the function, we'll throw an E in the parentheses for the event variable. And then if E.key triple equals enter, handle guess. All right. Secret number is 91. Let's try 75. Enter. Too low. Let's try 99. Enter. Too high. And I think you get the picture. All right, folks. And with that, we're done. We now have a fully functional guess the number game built with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Of course, there are some tweaks we could make to the CSS to improve the look, or ways we could clean up the JavaScript code or even add new features. But at this point, we have something that works, and that's the ultimate goal. A common question that a lot of beginners tend to ask is this the best way to do this, or is there a better way to write this JavaScript? And while the technical answer might be yes in many cases, honestly, if the code works, that's what really matters. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. There is no problem with having code that is a little bit messy or maybe not the best way to do something, so long as it just works. And so that wraps up this entire Basics of Web Development tutorial series. Whether you've been following along since episode 1 or you're just tuning in for this project, please consider leaving a like or subscribing. I really do appreciate all the support. I've got a lot of ideas swimming around in my head for some future videos, whether they're tutorials, some devlogs, or maybe some other fun programming related content. So I hope to catch you next time, whatever that ends up being.